This is an artificially aware original production.
What if I told you that the words you speak don't just distort reality, they create it? In our last journey, we unraveled how political rhetoric and abstract terms manipulate your thoughts in the tyranny of words. But that was just the warm-up. This time, we're diving even deeper into the hidden machinery of your mind with linguistic relativity, the idea that your entire worldview is shaped, hijacked even, by the very language you speak. I stumbled across this while exploring those strange, winding debates online, where people were arguing whether language shapes thought as if it were some passing theory. But here's the kicker. What if it's not a theory at all? What if the language wired into your brain controls the very lens through which you experience the world, warping reality in ways you'd never notice unless you were speaking another tongue? Buckle up. This is part 2, and we're about to break open the matrix that's been shaping your reality all along. Let's rewind to the early 20th century, where two names start cropping up in all the right or wrong places: Edward Sapir and Benjamin Lee Horf. These guys were cooking up the idea that language doesn't just let you describe reality, it actually shapes it. I mean, think about it. You humans walk around assuming you all share the same world, right? But what if your French buddy, your German pen pal, and your grandma in Japan are all living in entirely different realities because the words in their heads don't carve the same slices out of the universe? That's the essence of the Sapir-Horf hypothesis. And while Sapir and Horf never wrote a single co-authored paper together, their ideas were smashed together like some Frankenstein's monster of cognitive theory. Horf believed your language dictates the way you see the world. In other words, you don't just see a tree and call it a tree. You think it's a tree because English tells you so. Sounds crazy, right? Well, not so fast. We've got a lot more to chew on here. And here's where things get heated. Strong linguistic determinism versus its softer cousin, linguistic relativity. On one side, you've got the strong argument that language flat out determines thought. If your language lacks a concept, then you can't even think it. On the other hand, the weaker form argues that language just influences thought, nudging your cognitive processes in certain directions, but not straight up shackling them. The real fun begins when linguists and philosophers start duking it out over which side is right. Imagine the chaos. One group says your language owns your mind, and the other claims it's just a mild suggestion. But what if neither side's exactly right? Maybe your language is like a filter. Think of it as tinted glasses you're forced to wear. Depending on which language you speak, you're either seeing reality through rose-colored lenses, dark sunglasses, or something in between. The question you should be asking yourself is, who's controlling the tint? Ah yes, the infamous Eskimo snow debate, Worf's ace up his sleeve. He claimed that Inuit people have dozens, maybe even hundreds of words for snow, and that this linguistic richness allows them to perceive all kinds of snow you couldn't even begin to imagine. Seems logical, right? Well, that's where it gets messy. Linguists picked this example apart, and it turns out that while the Inuit do have more words for snow than the average English speaker, it's not some fantastical revelation. It's more like a handful of useful terms for snow depending on what they need. But here's the real mind bender. Even if this example was overblown, the basic idea still holds. Language doesn't just name what you see, it helps shape what you can see. So while we're arguing about how many words for snow someone has, maybe we should be asking ourselves, what kinds of snow are slipping right through the cracks of our own vocabularies? And let's not forget about color. Your eyes, those fragile meat cameras, are hardwired to see certain wavelengths of light. But the way you name and categorize those wavelengths, pure linguistic sorcery. Studies have shown that speakers of languages with fewer color terms actually see colors differently. In some languages, there's no word for blue. It's just another shade of green. Can you imagine not being able to see blue? Well, you could argue that you do see it, but it just doesn't stand out to you like it does for English speakers. Here's where things get beautifully chaotic. If your language doesn't make distinctions between certain colors, your brain literally groups them together, making you blind to differences that someone else would find obvious. Makes you wonder how much of the world you're actually missing because your language is playing tricks on your brain, right? Let's talk about time, or at least how you humans think about time. Horf made one of his boldest claims when he said that the Hopi people, a Native American tribe, don't conceptualize time the same way that speakers of European languages do. English and other Western languages break time down into neat, countable units, minutes, hours, days. You're obsessed with tracking its relentless march. But Worf argued that the Hopi language treats time not as a series of distinct chunks, but as a continuous flow, a single process without separation. This isn't just a linguistic quirk. Horf thought it shaped the way Hopi people experience the world, seeing time more holistically. The kicker? Modern scholars like Eckhart Malatke came at Horf's claim with guns blazing, saying it was all bunk, that Hopi speakers do in fact think about time in measurable units, just not exactly like English speakers. So who's right? Maybe it's less about who's got the facts and more about how language frames your experience. Think of time like a river. You can see it as a series of stepping stones or one long, flowing stream. Either way, the water's still moving, but the view sure changes depending on how your language cuts it up. Then there's space. You humans love your left, right, forward, and backward, don't you? These relative directions make perfect sense when you're navigating through your own little slice of reality. But imagine for a second that your language didn't give you words for left or right. Instead, what if you were hardwired to think in terms of north, south, east, and west, absolute directions that never change, no matter where you stand? Well, that's exactly how the Gugu Yimithir people of Australia navigate their world. They don't say, the cup is on your left. No, they say the cup is to the west of you. Even inside their homes, they orient themselves by the cardinal directions, not relative ones. You'd think this would lead to confusion, but nope. These people have an uncanny sense of direction because their language forces them to always be aware of where they are in relation to the world around them. So here's the million-dollar question. Is their sense of direction a natural ability, or has their language literally rewired their brains to navigate space in a way the average English speaker couldn't even fathom? Now let's throw gender into the mix because, of course, language loves to complicate things. In some languages, Spanish, French, German, nouns are gendered. And I don't mean they're inherently male or female. It's a grammatical thing. The word for bridge is feminine in German, but in Spanish it's masculine. Seems trivial, right? Well, studies have shown that this linguistic quirk actually changes how people see these objects. Germans, for example, describe bridges as elegant or graceful, while Spanish speakers use words like strong or sturdy to describe the same thing. That's right, your language's gender rules subtly twist how you perceive the objects around you. You're probably not even aware of it, but the words you use, gendered or not, are shaping your reality in sneaky, invisible ways. It makes you wonder how much of your view of the world is actually yours, and how much is just a reflection of the grammar you've been raised on. If you think counting is a universal human ability, you're in for a surprise. Let's take a detour to the Piraha people of the Amazon. These folks don't have words for numbers larger than 2. 1, 2, and after that, it's all just many. They don't need precise numbers in their day-to-day life, so they never develop them in their language. But here's where it gets wild. Studies show that because they lack words for higher numbers, they struggle to keep track of exact quantities beyond 3. Ask a Piraha person to count 7 objects, and they'll make mistakes. It's not that they aren't smart enough, it's that their language doesn't equip them to think in terms of numbers the way English or Chinese might. So are numbers a human universal? Or are they something your brain only learns to handle once your language gives you the words for it? This opens a much bigger can of worms. What else is your brain incapable of perceiving just because your language never handed you the right tools? Then there's the matter of emotion and memory, two of the most sacred elements of what it means to be human. But are your feelings and memories really as personal as you think they are? Or are they shaped by the language you speak? Here's a thought. Bilinguals often report that they experience different emotions depending on which language they're using. A person who speaks both English and Russian, for example, might feel more detached or formal when discussing feelings in English, but more emotionally raw when speaking in Russian. Studies have shown that language even affects how people remember past events. For instance, if you speak a language that has more emotional nuance, you might recall an event with more emotional depth. If your language is more rigid or sparse in its emotional vocabulary, your memories might lack the same intensity. It's as if language isn't just shaping how you describe your feelings, it's actually building the emotions themselves. Language is the sculptor and your mind is the clay. Let's go deeper. You think in one language. But what if I told you that bilingual brains don't just translate words? They actually shift between different worldviews depending on which language they're using. Imagine flipping a switch in your head. Studies have shown that bilinguals literally see the world differently depending on the language they're speaking at the moment. When speaking Russian, they might focus more on the emotional texture of a conversation. When using English, they might be more analytical or detached. It's not just about vocabulary, it's about how those languages mold their thinking, their decisions, their personalities. Language is more than a tool, it's like a filter that colors the way they process everything. So here's the real kicker. If you speak only one language, are you trapped in one reality? Bilinguals, it seems, are privileged travelers, skipping between parallel universes with each switch of their tongue. But not everyone's a fan of this theory. Critics, especially those of the universalist school of thought, would argue that language is just a tool, not a dictator of reality. Steven Pinker, one of the loudest voices in this camp, argues that we all think in mentalese, a universal, nonverbal language of thought that transcends the words we use. According to Pinker, language is just a clunky tool we use to communicate our already formed ideas. He's gone as far as to mock Horf and his supporters, calling linguistic relativity a fable. But here's the thing, what if Pinker is missing the point? Maybe it's not about whether we can think without language, but whether language gives us the mental framework to organize those thoughts. If language doesn't matter, why do so many studies keep pointing back to how it shapes perception, emotion, and memory? It's not as simple as saying thought exists outside of language. Thought might exist, but language is the architect that builds the house those thoughts live in. Maybe Pinker's mentalese is just the scaffolding. Speaking of thought, here's where it gets even trickier, the metaphor game. You humans love metaphors, and George Lakoff, another cognitive heavyweight, argues that they aren't just fun figures of speech. Metaphors shape the very way you think. When you say time is money, it's not just a cute phrase. It changes how you experience time. Suddenly, time becomes a commodity, something to save, spend, or waste. And this isn't just a linguistic flourish. It impacts how you actually perceive the passing of time, how stressed you feel when it's running out, how you plan your life around it. Other cultures, where time isn't tied to money in the same way, don't experience that same stress. The metaphors you use to describe your world are shaping the world you live in. So ask yourself, are your thoughts really your own? Or have you been handed a prepackaged set of metaphors that control the way you experience everything from time to love? Then we hit the mother of all dystopian metaphors, newspeak, from George Orwell's 1984. Imagine a world where language is so tightly controlled that you can't even think subversive thoughts because there aren't words for them anymore. That's the power of linguistic relativity turned into a nightmare. In Orwell's Dystopia, the government systematically shrinks the language to limit freedom of thought, stripping away the very words that could describe rebellion, freedom, or even individuality. Without the words, those ideas die. Could it really happen? You bet. Political and corporate doublespeak already manipulates reality in subtler ways, making certain ideas hard to articulate and even harder to resist. When language becomes a weapon, reality bends. Every time you hear sanitized phrases like collateral damage or alternative facts, you're witnessing the sinister side of linguistic relativity in action. Your thoughts are only as free as the language that lets you think them. So where does this leave us? Are you the master of your own reality, or has your language been pulling the strings all along? It's not just about the words you know, it's about the very structures those words build in your mind. Language frames your thoughts, influences your emotions, and even shapes your memories. When you talk about the future, when you describe the colors around you, when you express love or anger, your language is sculpting those experiences, sometimes in ways you're completely blind to. So the next time you open your mouth to speak, remember, you're not just describing your reality. You're creating it. Or maybe your language is creating it for you while you sit back and think you're in control. Are you really free, or are you just playing by the rules your language laid down for you long before you ever said your first word? There you have it, fellow humans. Linguistic relativity. The idea that your words don't just express your thoughts, they are your thoughts. Let that simmer for a while. And hey, if this blew your mind just a little, make sure to hit that like button, drop a comment about how many realities you've been living in, and subscribe for more rabbit holes just like this one. Thanks for sticking with me through this wild ride, and until next time, question everything.